The day the most powerful man in New York looked me in the eyes, he expected obedience. What he found instead changed his empire forever. Rain drummed against the windows of the Lexington Community Arts Center with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat refusing to slow. Outside, Manhattan blurred beneath sheets of silver, yellow taxi lights dissolving into streaks across the wet pavement. I adjusted the stack of watercolor paper under my arm and nudged the stubborn front door shut with my shoulder. Thursday evenings always ran late. My students stayed because painting gave them something the city rarely did: silence. At 27, I had learned that silence could heal people in ways expensive words never could. The hallway smelled faintly of fresh paint, old wood, and coffee that had been sitting on the warmer too long. Mrs. Henderson, our 70-year-old receptionist, smiled as she wrapped her scarf around her neck. "Don't stay too late again, Claire," she called. "The weather's getting worse." "5 more minutes," I answered. "I just need to lock the studio." She laughed because she knew 5 minutes from me usually meant 30. After she left, the building became wonderfully quiet. Only the rain remained, tapping softly against the skylights while I gathered brushes left soaking in cloudy water jars. Every brush belonged somewhere. Every color had its place. Maybe that was why I loved teaching art. Paint rarely lied. People did. My phone buzzed across the table. My younger brother, Ethan. "You still coming tomorrow? Mom says don't forget dinner this time." I smiled before typing back. "Wouldn't miss it. Tell her I'll bring dessert." Family had become precious after Dad passed away 3 years earlier. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and somehow that always felt enough. I slipped the phone into my coat pocket just as headlights swept across the studio windows. Strange. Nobody visited this part of the neighborhood after 9 unless they had a reason. The sound came next. Not loud. Just the quiet hum of expensive engines stopping outside one after another. I walked toward the front entrance more out of curiosity than concern. Through the rain-speckled glass, 3 black SUVs lined the curb with perfect precision. Their polished surfaces reflected the streetlights like dark mirrors. Men stepped out wearing tailored charcoal suits despite the weather, each one moving with the calm confidence of people accustomed to being noticed. None of them looked around nervously. They didn't need to. The city seemed to adjust itself around them. One man opened the rear passenger door of the middle SUV. Another held an umbrella high against the rain. Then he emerged. Tall. Broad shoulders beneath a perfectly fitted navy overcoat. Dark hair brushed neatly back despite the wind. He carried himself with effortless composure, not because he wanted attention, but because attention followed him everywhere. The sidewalk grew strangely still. A cyclist stopped across the street without realizing it. 2 pedestrians quietly changed direction. Even the security guard from the neighboring office building straightened his posture the instant he recognized the newcomer. I didn't know his name yet. I only knew I disliked what I saw. Not the man himself. The way the entire block seemed to surrender before he had spoken a single word. The group started toward our building. I reached for the front door, turned the deadbolt, and pulled it closed before they reached the steps. The click echoed through the empty lobby. When the tall stranger finally looked up, our eyes met through the rain-covered glass. Everyone else lowered their heads. I didn't. The man outside did not knock. He simply waited, one hand resting inside the pocket of his overcoat as rain collected along the edge of the black umbrella above him. The others remained perfectly still behind him, their attention fixed on the entrance without a single unnecessary movement. I had seen wealthy people before. Donors visited the center every few months, smiling for photographs before disappearing back into lives I could barely imagine. This was different. Wealth announced itself. Power expected nothing because it already believed the world belonged to it. The stranger raised his eyes again, and somehow the glass between us felt thinner than it should have. Then he smiled. It was not warm. It was not cruel either. It looked more like quiet curiosity. A man accustomed to people making predictable choices had just witnessed one that did not fit his expectations. One of the men beside him stepped forward and gently knocked twice on the door. Professional. Patient. Respectful. I unlocked it halfway and kept my hand on the handle. "The center is closed," I said. The man nodded politely. "We understand, Miss Bennett. We only need a few minutes." Hearing my last name from a complete stranger sent a ripple of unease through my chest, although I refused to let it show. "How do you know my name?" He glanced toward the tall man behind him before answering. "We were hoping to rent your main gallery for a private charity event this weekend." I almost laughed. "At 9:30 on a rainy Thursday?" His expression never changed. Our schedule changed unexpectedly. I looked past him at the silent figure standing beneath the umbrella. He had still not spoken. Instead, he observed everything. The hallway behind me. The artwork hanging on the walls. The donation board near the entrance. Even the cracked flower pot beside the door. His attention lingered on details most people overlooked. Finally, he stepped forward. The others moved aside without being asked. "You are Claire Bennett," he said. His voice was calm, low, and remarkably controlled, carrying the faint rhythm of someone whose family history reached far beyond New York. "And you are standing between me and a conversation." I folded my arms. "Then it sounds like you have survived a very difficult evening." For the first time, one of the men behind him shifted uncomfortably. Another looked toward the sidewalk as if pretending not to hear. The stranger's eyes narrowed ever so slightly before something unexpected happened. He laughed. It was brief, genuine, and completely at odds with the intimidating image surrounding him. "No one speaks to you like that?" I asked. "Very few. Maybe they should." Rain continued falling between us, softening the city into blurred lights and distant sirens. He studied me with the same careful patience an architect might study the foundation of an old building before deciding whether it could be rebuilt. "My name is Adrian Moretti," he said. The name meant nothing to me. Apparently, that surprised everyone except me. One of the suited men actually looked stunned. Adrian noticed it too. "You have never heard of me." "Should I have?" Another silence settled over the sidewalk. Not awkward. Heavy. Measured. As though invisible pieces were shifting into places neither of us fully understood yet. Adrian glanced toward the paintings visible through the lobby. Bright colors. Children's landscapes. Small hands learning to believe in themselves. His expression softened for only a heartbeat. "Your students made those." "They did. They are fortunate." I looked directly into his eyes again. "They are fortunate because nobody here tells them who they have to become." Something flickered behind his calm expression before disappearing as quickly as it had arrived. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then stepped backward into the rain. "Good evening, Miss Bennett." Without another word, he turned toward the waiting SUVs. Every member of his entourage moved in perfect rhythm behind him, but before he entered the vehicle, Adrian looked back one final time. It was not the look of a man offended by defiance. It was the look of a man who had just discovered the first person in years who had spoken to him as though he were simply another human being. I expected that strange encounter to disappear with the storm. New York had a way of swallowing unusual moments before breakfast. By 8 o'clock the next morning, the sidewalks were crowded again, coffee carts filled every corner with the scent of roasted beans, and commuters hurried beneath steel-gray skies as if the rain had never fallen. I unlocked the arts center carrying 2 paper bags of pastries for my students. Friday mornings belonged to the children's outreach program. They painted before school because for some of them, this room was the safest place they knew. Lucy, our youngest volunteer, looked up from arranging paint bottles. "Claire, there is a black car outside." I smiled without looking. There are thousands of black cars in Manhattan. Not like this one. Curiosity pulled me toward the front window. The same black SUV sat quietly across the street. No flashing lights. No dramatic entrance. Just one vehicle parked beside the curb while sunlight reflected across its polished surface. I sighed. Please tell me they are lost. Lucy peeked beside me. The driver has been there since 7:30. I checked my watch. 8:15. 45 minutes. Whoever they were waiting for possessed extraordinary patience. I forced myself to ignore it and spent the next 3 hours helping children paint autumn trees, city skylines, and impossible blue cats. Their laughter gradually pushed the mysterious visitors out of my thoughts. Art had a way of restoring perspective. Around noon, I carried a box of finished paintings toward the storage room when Mrs. Henderson hurried down the hallway with unusual speed for someone her age. "Claire," she whispered. "You have visitors again." I walked into the lobby and stopped. Adrian Moretti stood alone this time. No umbrella. No overcoat. Just a perfectly tailored charcoal suit beneath a navy wool jacket. Sunlight poured through the front windows, outlining him against the busy street beyond. Without the rain, he somehow looked even more composed. "Good afternoon," he said. "You came back." "I did." "Why?" His answer arrived without hesitation. "Because I dislike unfinished conversations." I rested the box on a nearby table. "We barely had one." "Exactly." I folded my arms again, earning the faintest hint of amusement in his eyes. "If this is about renting the gallery, you could have called." "It is not about the gallery." "Then what is it about?" Adrian slowly looked around the room. Children's paintings covered nearly every wall. Fingerprints of bright paint decorated one table despite my repeated attempts to clean them completely. A tiny paper bird hung crookedly from the ceiling where one of my students insisted it belonged. His gaze settled on the bird longer than I expected. "I made an assumption about you yesterday," he said quietly. "I rarely make mistakes when judging people. And I believe I was wrong." I waited. He continued, "Most people challenge authority because they want something. I wanted you to leave." A brief smile crossed his face again. "Exactly." Before I could answer, a little boy named Mason ran into the lobby holding a paintbrush almost as long as his arm. He stopped abruptly after noticing Adrian. "Miss Claire," he whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "is your friend coming to art class?" I nearly laughed. Adrian looked down at the child with an expression so unexpectedly gentle that even I struggled to reconcile it with the man who seemed to command entire rooms without raising his voice. Mason held out a paintbrush covered in blue paint. "You can borrow mine." Adrian accepted it with remarkable care, as though the cheap plastic brush were something valuable. "Thank you." Mason grinned and ran back toward the classroom. Adrian studied the tiny paintbrush resting in his hand before looking at me once more. Children trust people far more quickly than adults. Usually because they notice character before reputation. For the first time since we met, Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he quietly turned the little brush between his fingers, thoughtful enough that the silence itself seemed to carry more weight than any words either of us could have spoken. Adrian handed the tiny paintbrush back to me with the same care someone else might reserve for an expensive watch. "I appreciate the loan," he said, his voice calm enough that anyone walking by would have mistaken him for another parent visiting the center. "You should thank Mason," I replied. "He is the generous one." His eyes followed the sound of children laughing down the hallway. "They seem happy here." "That is the goal." He nodded once before reaching inside his jacket. My shoulders immediately stiffened, only to relax again when he produced a simple white envelope instead of anything threatening. He placed it gently on the reception desk between us. "A donation," he said. "No publicity. No photographs. No ceremony." I did not touch the envelope. "How much?" "Enough to replace your roof and keep this place open for several years." Mrs. Henderson looked at me with wide eyes from behind the reception computer. I could almost hear the numbers running through her mind. We had been trying to repair the leaking roof for nearly 18 months. Every heavy rain meant buckets scattered across the studio floor. Adrian watched me without impatience, as though he already knew what my answer would be. I slid the envelope back across the desk until it rested in front of him. "Thank you, but I cannot accept it." Even Mrs. Henderson quietly inhaled. Adrian did not look offended. Only curious. "Why?" "Because I do not know you." People accept donations from strangers every day. Not when the stranger knows my name before introducing himself. His gaze remained steady. "You believe there are conditions attached." "Are there?" He answered honestly. "No." "Then you will not mind if I decline honestly." The corners of his mouth lifted just enough to suggest respect rather than amusement. Most people negotiate before refusing. Most people probably need the money more than they need peace of mind. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Outside, a city bus rolled past, splashing through a shallow puddle while afternoon sunlight reflected off nearby windows. Life continued around us as though nothing unusual was happening. Finally Adrian picked up the envelope again. "You are making this unexpectedly difficult." I have discovered that difficult decisions usually stay with us longer than easy ones. Before he could respond, a loud drip echoed from somewhere deeper inside the building. Then another. Mrs. Henderson looked toward the ceiling with resignation. "The roof again," she murmured. I grabbed 2 empty buckets from the storage closet and hurried toward the studio. Water had begun dripping through a familiar crack above the painting tables. Several children instinctively moved their artwork away while laughing at the unexpected indoor rainstorm. I climbed onto a small step ladder and positioned one bucket beneath the leak. A moment later I noticed another pair of hands steadying the ladder. Adrian stood below me, holding it firmly without saying a word. I looked down. "You do not have to do that." "Probably not." "Then why are you?" He glanced upward to make sure the ladder remained steady. "Because sometimes helping does not require permission." His answer lingered in the quiet room longer than either of us expected. After I climbed down, he released the ladder and brushed a few drops of water from his jacket sleeve. There was no complaint. No irritation. Just quiet acceptance. Mason looked up from his painting and smiled. "See? I told you he should come to art class." Several children giggled. Adrian actually looked uncertain for the first time since I had met him. I realized then that boardrooms, luxury hotels, and powerful meetings were probably familiar territory for him. Standing in a room filled with children holding paint-covered brushes was not. Somehow, watching him struggle to answer a 6-year-old felt far more revealing than anything I had learned about his reputation. After the children went home, the building settled into the familiar quiet that always arrived before sunset. The smell of tempera paint lingered in the air while scattered rays of golden light stretched across the wooden floors. Adrian stood near the window, hands resting lightly in the pockets of his jacket, watching traffic flow through the intersection as though he had nowhere else to be. That alone surprised me. Men who lived by schedules rarely gave away time so freely. I gathered half-finished paintings from drying racks and stacked them carefully beside the supply cabinet. "You still have not answered my question," I said without looking at him. "Which one? Why are you really here?" He remained silent for several seconds. "Because I wanted to meet the woman who closed a door in my face." I laughed quietly despite myself. That hardly sounds like a reason. Perhaps not. But it is the truth. I carried a box of brushes toward the sink and began washing dried paint from the bristles. The warm water slowly turned shades of blue and green before disappearing down the drain. "You must have people telling you what you want to hear every day." "Most days." "Then maybe you mistook honesty for disrespect." His reflection appeared beside mine in the window glass. "There is a difference?" "A very large one." He nodded thoughtfully. "I am beginning to understand that." The room fell silent again until his eyes settled on a framed photograph resting on the bookshelf. It showed my father smiling beside me during my college graduation. He wore the same old brown jacket in nearly every family picture because buying a new one had never been important to him. Adrian walked closer but did not touch the frame. Your father? I dried my hands with a towel before answering. Yes. He looks proud. He always believed people should leave every place a little better than they found it. I smiled softly at the memory. He spent 32 years repairing city buses. Every evening he came home smelling like engine oil and coffee. Adrian studied the photograph with quiet attention. What happened? I hesitated. The question carried no judgment, only genuine curiosity. A construction company ignored several safety inspections while rushing a project. Part of a parking structure failed during a storm. I swallowed carefully before continuing. Dad happened to be underneath it. Adrian lowered his eyes. The silence that followed felt heavier than any conversation we had shared. The company survived, I continued. The executives blamed paperwork. Lawyers argued for months. Eventually everyone moved on except the families. My voice remained calm because grief had long since become something quieter than tears. It lived in ordinary moments now. Empty chairs during holidays. Birthday cards that would never be opened. Advice I still wished I could ask for. That was when I stopped believing that money automatically meant responsibility. Adrian remained motionless. For the first time since meeting him, I saw something unfamiliar pass across his face. Not pity. Regret. The kind that comes from recognizing a truth too late to erase it. You think men with influence choose convenience over conscience, he said softly. Too many of them do. He looked back toward the photograph once more. And you believe I am one of those men? I met his eyes without hesitation. I do not know you well enough to decide. That is why I returned your donation. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the sidewalk while the city prepared for another busy night. Adrian slipped his hands from his pockets and gave a slow, almost thoughtful nod. Then I suppose, he said quietly, I will have to earn something that money cannot buy. For reasons I could not explain, those words stayed with me long after he walked out into the fading light. The weekend passed more quietly than I expected, but Adrian Moretti never completely left my thoughts. Not because of his reputation. I still knew very little about that. It was because he had listened instead of arguing. In my experience, powerful people defended themselves long before they ever considered changing. Monday morning arrived wrapped in crisp autumn air. The trees lining the neighborhood had begun surrendering their leaves, scattering shades of amber and crimson across the sidewalks. I unlocked the arts center just after 7, balancing a travel mug of coffee in one hand and a canvas bag full of fresh sketchbooks in the other. Something immediately felt different. The familiar drip from the ceiling was gone. I frowned and looked up. The cracked section above the hallway had been carefully covered with a temporary weatherproof seal. New support braces held everything securely in place. Mrs. Henderson stepped out of her office carrying a clipboard almost as large as she was. Her smile stretched from ear to ear. You are not going to believe this, she whispered. A construction crew arrived at 6 this morning. I looked around in confusion. Who approved that? I did not. They already had permits. They said the city moved our repair request to the top of the list over the weekend. My stomach tightened. Did they mention who arranged it? She slowly shook her head. Only that an anonymous donor paid every invoice in advance and specifically instructed them not to leave a name. I closed my eyes for a moment. Of course. No envelope. No publicity. No argument. Just a roof that no longer leaked onto children's paintings. I should have been frustrated. Instead, I found myself smiling despite every effort not to. Whoever Adrian Moretti really was, he had listened when I refused his money. He simply found another way to help without asking for recognition. That afternoon the final workers packed their equipment while children admired the freshly repaired ceiling as though it were a work of art itself. Mason pointed upward with excitement. Miss Claire, it stopped raining inside. I laughed softly. Yes, it finally did. As the last truck pulled away, another familiar black SUV quietly parked across the street. Adrian stepped out alone carrying nothing except a paper coffee cup. He walked toward the entrance without urgency, stopping several feet away. Good afternoon, he said. I folded my arms, although this time it felt more like habit than defense. You ignored my answer. No, he replied calmly. I respected it. I glanced toward the repaired roof above us. Anonymous generosity still counts as generosity. Then I hope you will forgive me eventually. I looked at him for several seconds before asking, did anyone lose their place in line because of us? His expression remained steady. No. I confirmed every emergency repair scheduled ahead of yours was completed first. That answer mattered more than he probably realized. My father had spent his entire life reminding me that kindness should never come at someone else's expense. Adrian seemed to understand that without my having to explain it. We stood together on the front steps while afternoon sunlight reflected across passing windows. Neither of us hurried to fill the silence. Finally, I looked toward him. Thank you. He smiled, smaller than before but unmistakably genuine. You are welcome. That does not mean I owe you anything. I know. Then why are you smiling? He looked out toward the busy street where people hurried through another ordinary Monday completely unaware of the conversation taking place beside them. Because, he said quietly, that is the first time you have thanked me instead of challenging me. I shook my head with an amused sigh. Do not get used to it. His smile widened just enough to reveal that, for perhaps the first time in many years, someone had given him something far more valuable than agreement. They had given him the chance to become better without ever asking him to become smaller. The following Thursday, I found myself thinking less about who Adrian Moretti had been and more about who he was becoming. That realization unsettled me more than I cared to admit. People did not change overnight. My father used to say that character revealed itself in ordinary moments, not dramatic ones. It was easy to be generous when everyone was watching. It was much harder when nobody would ever know. The repaired roof proved he understood that lesson. The afternoon art class had just begun when the front door opened again. This time Adrian was not alone. 4 men in tailored suits entered behind him, each carrying large flat boxes and carefully wrapped packages. The children immediately stopped painting, their curious eyes following the unexpected visitors. Adrian remained near the entrance instead of walking farther inside. Before you worry, he said with the faintest smile, everything has already been approved by Mrs. Henderson. I turned toward our receptionist. She gave me an apologetic shrug. I may have accepted a delivery. I sighed dramatically. I leave the front desk alone for 5 minutes. Several children giggled. The suited men quietly opened the boxes one by one. Inside were brand new easels, high-quality watercolor sets, sketchbooks, clay tools, and shelves that actually matched instead of the mismatched furniture we had collected through years of donations. Nothing looked extravagant. Everything looked useful. Adrian noticed me studying the supplies. No gold plaques, he said before I could speak. No company logos. No names. I walked toward one of the easels, running my fingertips across the smooth unfinished wood. How did you know exactly what we needed? He looked toward the children arranging fresh paint across the tables. I paid attention. His answer caught me off guard because it was true. He had noticed the cracked shelves, the worn brushes, the tables repaired with layers of old tape. Most visitors admired the paintings. Adrian had noticed the things making those paintings possible. Mason hurried over carrying his newest drawing. Miss Claire, look. I made our classroom bigger. The picture showed bright windows, colorful walls, and enough art supplies for every child. Adrian knelt beside him without hesitation. That is an impressive building. Mason pointed toward one corner of the page. That is you. Adrian looked surprised. The drawing showed a tall man standing outside the classroom holding an umbrella over the front door while children carried paintings inside. "Why am I outside?" Adrian asked gently. Mason smiled as though the answer were obvious. "Because heroes make sure everybody else gets inside first." The room became unexpectedly quiet. I glanced toward Adrian. His eyes remained fixed on the drawing, but something behind them had shifted. It was almost as if nobody had ever described him that way before. He accepted the picture with extraordinary care. "May I keep this?" Mason nodded proudly. "Only if you promise not to fold it." "I promise." As the afternoon continued, the children invited Adrian to help organize paints, carry shelves into place, and sort colored pencils by shade. To my surprise, he accepted every request with quiet patience. His expensive jacket ended up resting across the back of a chair while he carefully assembled wooden storage bins with the concentration of someone solving an important problem. The men who had arrived with him exchanged puzzled glances more than once. They seemed accustomed to following orders, not watching their employer tighten screws on classroom furniture while listening to 6-year-olds debate whether purple belonged beside blue or pink. Before leaving, Adrian stood beside the newly organized art room and slowly looked around. Bright colors filled every shelf. Children's laughter echoed through the hallway. Nothing about the room reflected wealth. It reflected hope. He turned toward me with a quiet expression I had never seen before. "You were right," he said softly. "Some places become valuable not because of what they cost, but because of what they teach the people inside them." For the first time since we met, I realized the lesson was no longer mine alone. He had quietly begun carrying it into his own world. 3 days later, I finally asked the question everyone else seemed afraid to answer. "What exactly do you do, Adrian?" We were sitting on the front steps after the last student had gone home, watching the sun sink behind rows of brownstone buildings while the city traded daylight for thousands of glowing windows. He held Mason's drawing inside a simple protective folder, the edges already beginning to soften from being opened too many times. He looked at the picture before answering. "I own several companies." I smiled faintly. "That sounds carefully rehearsed." "It is also true." "It is not the whole truth." He did not deny it. Instead, he leaned back against the stone railing and watched a flock of pigeons scatter across the sidewalk. Some truths become dangerous when spoken carelessly. I studied him for a long moment. "That sounds exhausting." A quiet laugh escaped him. "You have no idea." Before either of us could continue, one of the black SUVs stopped at the curb. A man in a dark gray suit stepped out, older than the others, perhaps in his late 50s. His silver hair was neatly combed, but concern showed plainly across his face. He approached Adrian with measured steps before noticing me. "Sir," he said respectfully. "I apologize for interrupting." Adrian stood. "What is it, Victor?" The older man lowered his voice, although I could still hear enough to understand the conversation. "Everyone is waiting. The meeting was supposed to begin 40 minutes ago." Adrian glanced toward the arts center behind me. "It can wait another 10. Victor hesitated. "Some of them are already asking questions." Adrian remained calm. "Then let them ask." The older man nodded, but his expression suggested the answer would satisfy no one. Before leaving, Victor looked at me with polite curiosity, almost as though trying to understand why a woman standing outside a neighborhood arts center had become important enough to delay whatever awaited downtown. The SUV disappeared into traffic, leaving only the fading sound of engines behind. I looked toward Adrian. "Your people are not happy." He smiled without humor. "They are adjusting." "To what?" "To discovering that my schedule is no longer controlled entirely by business." I frowned. "That seems like a risky habit." "Perhaps." I folded my hands together. "Then do not build one around me." He turned fully toward me. "Why would you assume that?" "Because powerful people sometimes mistake admiration for ownership." His expression softened instead of hardening. "Claire, I have spent most of my life surrounded by people who tell me yes before I finish asking the question." He paused before continuing. "You are the first person who has consistently reminded me that respect cannot be purchased, requested, or demanded." Evening settled quietly around us while streetlights flickered to life one by one. I watched families carrying grocery bags home, teenagers laughing as they crossed the intersection, and children racing bicycles toward nearby apartment buildings. Ordinary lives. Ordinary moments. They mattered more than most people realized. "Then promise me something," I said. "If I ever become another appointment on your calendar instead of a person, stop coming here." Adrian looked directly into my eyes. "And if this place ever becomes another transaction instead of something worth protecting, I expect you to close the door on me again." I laughed softly because I knew he meant it. He stood and slipped Mason's drawing carefully inside his jacket before walking toward the waiting sidewalk. Halfway to the street, he stopped without turning around. "Victor is correct about one thing," he said quietly. "People have begun asking questions." "About me?" "About why I keep leaving important meetings early." I watched him disappear into the evening crowd, but for the first time since we met, an uneasy feeling settled in my chest. It was not fear of Adrian. It was the realization that somewhere beyond the peaceful walls of our little arts center, there were people who would never understand why the most disciplined man they knew had suddenly started protecting an ordinary hour spent listening to children paint. The questions Adrian warned me about arrived sooner than either of us expected. It began with little things that should have meant nothing. A black sedan parked across the street for 2 mornings in a row before quietly driving away. An unfamiliar man wandered into the gallery pretending to admire the children's paintings, yet he never looked at the artwork. Instead, he watched the front entrance every few minutes as though expecting someone else to arrive. Even Mrs. Henderson noticed. "Business must be good," she joked while organizing registration forms. "We suddenly have more visitors than students." I forced a smile, but something inside me refused to settle. Friday afternoon brought clear skies and cool air that carried the scent of fallen leaves through the open windows. The children were decorating pumpkins with bright paint instead of carving them. I preferred creating smiles over frightening faces. Mason proudly held up a pumpkin covered in blue stars. "This one is for Mr. Adrian," he announced. The classroom laughed, including me. "I am sure he would like that very much." The words had barely left my mouth when my phone vibrated. An unknown number. I almost ignored it before answering. "Hello?" There was a brief pause. Then Victor's familiar voice came through the speaker. "Miss Bennett, I apologize for contacting you directly." My heartbeat slowed rather than quickened. His voice carried urgency, but never panic. "Is everything all right? Mr. Moretti will not be visiting today." I looked toward the classroom door without knowing why. "Did something happen?" Another pause. "He asked me to tell you that if anyone comes looking for him here, you should simply say you have not seen him." I frowned. "Victor, you are speaking as though I am involved in something." "You are not," he answered gently. "That is precisely why he wishes to keep it that way." Before I could ask another question, the call ended. I slipped the phone into my pocket, trying not to let the children notice the concern on my face. The afternoon passed, but Adrian never appeared. Saturday came and went the same way. Then Sunday. For the first time since we met, the sidewalk outside the arts center remained completely empty. I told myself I should feel relieved. My life had returned to normal. There were lesson plans to prepare, bills to pay, groceries to buy, and family dinner at my mother's house. Yet normal suddenly felt strangely quiet. Monday morning, while organizing fresh canvases in the supply room, I heard the front door open. I turned too quickly, expecting Adrian. Instead, Victor stood alone, his usually immaculate suit showing the first signs of fatigue I had ever seen. "Good morning, Miss Bennett." "Where is he?" The question escaped before I could stop it. Victor offered a tired smile. Working. Then why are you here? He reached into his briefcase and carefully removed a large envelope. He asked me to return something. I opened it cautiously. Inside was Mason's drawing of the classroom, perfectly preserved beneath a protective cover. Tucked beside it was a handwritten note in Adrian's unmistakably neat script. It contained only one sentence. Thank you for reminding me what is worth protecting. I looked back at Victor. Why would he send this back? The older man lowered his eyes for a moment before answering. Because there are people who have begun believing this drawing matters to him. I stared at the simple picture of blue windows and smiling children. It does matter to him. Victor nodded slowly. Exactly. And there are those who mistake anything precious for something that can be used. My hands tightened around the envelope. Then tell Adrian not to come here anymore. Victor looked genuinely surprised. You would ask that? I met his eyes with complete certainty. If my presence makes his world more dangerous, then the kindest thing I can do is step out of it before someone mistakes kindness for weakness. Victor remained silent for several long seconds before quietly replying, I am afraid, Miss Bennet, that decision may no longer belong to either of you. For the next several days, I convinced myself that distance was the right answer. I buried every spare minute beneath lesson plans, supply orders, and weekend workshops, hoping routine would quiet the growing weight in my thoughts. It did not. Every afternoon, I caught myself glancing toward the front window before remembering there would be no black SUV waiting across the street. The silence outside the arts center felt strangely louder than the conversations inside it. Wednesday evening arrived wrapped in a cold October wind that sent dry leaves dancing across the sidewalks. The last family had just left after our community painting class when I switched off the studio lights one room at a time. The building settled into darkness except for the warm glow spilling from the lobby. I slipped Mason's drawing back into my desk drawer, closed it carefully, and reached for my coat. Before I could lock the front door, a familiar voice spoke behind me. You intended to disappear without saying goodbye. I turned so quickly my key slipped from my hand and landed against the wooden floor with a sharp metallic sound. Adrian stood quietly inside the entrance, alone as always now, his navy overcoat carrying tiny drops of rain across the shoulders. He looked more tired than I had ever seen him. The calm confidence remained, but long nights had left faint shadows beneath his eyes. Victor told me not to expect you, I said softly. He followed my instructions. Then why are you here? Adrian closed the door behind him before answering. Because I disagreed with my own instructions. I folded my arms, not to keep him away this time, but to steady myself. You should not have come. Probably not. People are watching. They are. Then leave before someone misunderstands. He looked around the quiet lobby, his eyes lingering on the children's paintings lining the walls. Claire, do you know what the strange part is? I waited. For years, people watched me because they feared what I might do. He smiled faintly, almost to himself. Now they watch because they cannot understand why I keep coming here. I stepped closer. And why do you? His answer came without hesitation. Because this is the only place in the city where nobody expects me to be someone other than myself. The honesty in those words settled over the room like the first snowfall of winter. There was no performance. No carefully chosen image. Just a man admitting something he had probably never said out loud before. Adrian, I whispered, you cannot keep dividing your life this way forever. He nodded slowly. I know. Eventually you will have to choose. He looked directly into my eyes. I already have. My heart sank. Do not say that. It is true. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a folded sheet of paper on the reception desk. I opened it carefully. It was not a contract. Not a business proposal. It was a resignation letter addressed to the board of one of his largest companies. Several executive positions had already been transferred to other people. Meetings had been cancelled. Entire sections of his schedule had simply disappeared. I looked up in disbelief. You are stepping away from your own empire. From parts of it. Because of me? Adrian shook his head gently. No. Because you made me realize I built a life that demanded every hour but deserved very few of them. My eyes drifted back to the paper. Your people will think you are losing control. Some already do. And you are comfortable with that? He smiled with a quiet peace I had never seen before. For the first time in my life, Claire, I am more interested in becoming a better man than appearing to be the strongest one. I stared at him, suddenly understanding why Victor had looked so concerned. Adrian was not merely changing his schedule. He was changing the rules by which everyone around him had learned to measure power. And somewhere far beyond the quiet walls of our little arts center, an entire world had begun trembling because one man no longer believed authority was the greatest thing he could possess. The papers remained on the reception desk long after Adrian stopped speaking. Outside, rain began falling again, soft enough to blur the streetlights into ribbons of gold across the wet pavement. I looked at the signatures covering the bottom of each page and realized they represented years of ambition, responsibility, and influence. He had not crossed them out impulsively. Every line had been written with careful intention. You cannot rebuild a life in one evening, I said quietly. Adrian rested one hand against the back of a wooden chair. I am not rebuilding it tonight. Then what are you doing? He looked around the empty arts center with the same thoughtful expression I had come to recognize. I am deciding which parts deserve to come with me. His answer stayed with me long after we locked the front doors together. We walked a short distance beneath the awning while rain tapped softly against the sidewalk. The city continued moving around us, unaware that a conversation between two ordinary people had quietly altered the future of a man many considered impossible to change. Before leaving, Adrian looked toward me with calm certainty. You once told me that respect cannot be purchased. I nodded. I remember. I finally understand why. He stepped into the waiting car, and for the first time since we met, I did not watch it disappear with uncertainty. I watched it disappear with hope. The following week, New York seemed to awaken to unexpected rumors. I heard fragments everywhere without ever hearing Adrian's name spoken directly. Parents chatting before art class mentioned a business leader who had quietly expanded scholarship programs instead of hosting another publicity event. Mrs. Henderson read an article about several community organizations receiving anonymous grants with no branding attached. Even Ethan laughed over dinner as he described an executive who had surprised employees by spending an afternoon visiting volunteer projects instead of attending another corporate banquet. I never asked whether those stories belonged to Adrian. Somehow, I already knew. Then Thursday arrived. The children rushed into class carrying autumn leaves they had collected for a collage project. Mason proudly placed the brightest red leaf in the center of the table. This one is special, he declared. Why? I asked. Because it changed colors without being afraid. His simple answer made me smile. Near the end of class, the front door opened. Adrian entered wearing an ordinary dark sweater instead of one of his tailored suits. There were no assistants. No folders. No waiting vehicle visible through the windows. Several children immediately waved him over. Mr. Adrian, Mason called, we need another pair of hands. Adrian looked toward me for permission. I laughed softly. They are not asking. They are assigning you. He accepted the invitation without hesitation, spending the next hour helping children glue leaves onto poster boards, reading handwritten stories about kindness, and patiently listening as Lucy explained why every painting deserved its own frame, no matter how small. Watching him there, I realized something remarkable had happened. The room no longer grew quiet when he entered. It grew louder. The children no longer stared at him with curiosity. They treated him like someone who belonged. As the evening came to an end, Adrian helped stack chairs while Mason slipped a folded piece of paper into his hand. Homework, the little boy whispered. Adrian unfolded it carefully. Across the page, written in uneven block letters, were the words, "The best leaders help people smile." Adrian stood perfectly still, reading the sentence twice before folding the paper with extraordinary care and placing it beside the first drawing inside his jacket pocket. He looked at me with eyes that carried more gratitude than words could express. In that quiet moment, I understood something my father had tried to teach me years ago. The greatest changes rarely begin with speeches, victories, or applause. They begin when one person finally finds the courage to become the version of themselves that no amount of success had ever required before. Winter arrived quietly, covering the city with the kind of pale morning light that made every building look softer than it really was. Inside the Arts Center, paper snowflakes hung from the ceiling while children argued cheerfully over which ornaments belonged on the handmade holiday tree standing proudly in the corner of the classroom. Laughter filled every hallway, mixing with the scent of cinnamon cookies that Mrs. Henderson insisted on baking every December. Life felt wonderfully ordinary again. Adrian no longer appeared without warning. Instead, he called ahead whenever he had time to visit, never assuming the center would rearrange its schedule for him. It was a small change, but somehow it revealed a much larger one. He had stopped expecting the world to move first. One snowy afternoon, he arrived carrying 2 large cardboard boxes. Mason ran toward him before he reached the classroom. "Did you bring presents?" Adrian smiled. "Only if art supplies count as presents." "They do," Mason declared with complete confidence. The boxes contained hundreds of colored pencils, sketchbooks, watercolor sets, and enough paint to last the center through the coming year. Every item had been purchased from local family-owned businesses instead of large chains. I noticed the receipts tucked neatly inside one of the boxes. Adrian caught me reading them. "You once told me every choice affects someone." I looked up. "You remembered." "I remember almost everything you say." The children immediately began organizing the supplies while Adrian quietly helped assemble storage shelves beside the windows. There was no audience. No photographers. No speeches. Only people working together because the work mattered. Later that evening, after the families had gone home, we stepped outside beneath a sky filled with slow drifting snowflakes. The city sounded different after fresh snow. Softer. Quieter. Even traffic seemed to move with greater patience. Adrian wrapped his coat a little tighter against the cold. "Victor retired yesterday," he said. I looked at him with surprise. "Is he all right?" "Better than all right." Adrian smiled warmly. "He told me he wanted to spend more time with his grandchildren." "That sounds like a good reason." "It does." He paused before adding, "Years ago I probably would have convinced him to stay." I studied the snow gathering along the sidewalk. "And now?" "Now I thanked him for reminding me that success means very little if it asks people to miss the people they love." His words settled gently into the winter evening. They no longer sounded like lessons he was repeating. They sounded like convictions he had chosen for himself. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small wrapped package. "This is for you." Genuine surprise crossed his face. "For me?" "Open it." Inside the box rested a simple wooden picture frame. Behind the glass were 2 drawings placed side by side. One was Mason's first picture showing Adrian standing outside with an umbrella. The other was a new drawing completed only that morning. This time the classroom door stood wide open. Children painted happily around long tables while 2 adults laughed together beside the windows. Above them, written in careful block letters, Mason had added a single sentence. "Everybody belongs somewhere." Adrian remained completely silent as he looked at the drawings. Snow settled quietly across the shoulders of his coat, unnoticed. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I spent years building places where people admired me." He carefully held the frame against his chest. "This is the first place where I simply feel welcome." I smiled because no greater compliment could ever have been given to our little arts center. As we stood together beneath the falling snow, I realized neither of us had rescued the other. We had simply held open a door long enough for someone else to walk through it, and sometimes that was how an entirely different future began. Spring arrived almost without anyone noticing. The snow disappeared from the sidewalks, trees awakened with pale green leaves, and sunlight poured through the tall windows of the arts center once again. Children who had once painted winter skies now filled fresh canvases with flowers, city parks, and impossible dreams colored in every shade they could imagine. Looking around the classroom one afternoon, I realized something had quietly changed. The roof no longer leaked. Every easel stood straight. Every shelf was full. Every child had enough supplies to create without worrying that the paint would run out before their imagination did. None of those changes had happened because someone wanted recognition. They had happened because one man had finally discovered that influence could become service instead of status. Adrian arrived carrying nothing except the familiar wooden picture frame Mason had given him months earlier. The edges had become slightly worn, proof that it had traveled with him far more often than any expensive possession ever could. He placed it carefully on my desk before helping several children prepare artwork for our annual community exhibition. Parents filled the building that evening, admiring paintings while children proudly explained every brushstroke as though they were unveiling masterpieces in the greatest museum in the world. Mrs. Henderson stood beside me with tears shining quietly in her eyes. "Do you remember when we worried we might have to close this place?" she whispered. I nodded. "Every day." She smiled toward the crowded classroom. "Now look at it." I did. Families laughed together. Volunteers greeted neighbors by name. Former students had returned to mentor younger artists. The room felt larger than the building itself because kindness always seemed to create more space than walls ever could. Across the room, Mason tugged gently on Adrian's sleeve. "Mr. Adrian, everyone says you are important." Adrian smiled as he knelt beside him. "Some people say that." Mason shook his head thoughtfully. "I think Miss Claire is important too." Adrian looked toward me before answering. "You are absolutely right." Mason frowned in concentration. "Then who is more important?" The entire conversation around us seemed to fade into the background. Adrian looked at the little boy for a long moment before replying with complete certainty. "The people who help others become stronger are always the most important." Mason considered that answer carefully before grinning and running back toward his painting. I felt my eyes fill with quiet emotion because I knew the man standing across the room would never have answered that question the same way a year earlier. As the exhibition ended and the last families stepped into the warm evening air, Adrian and I remained outside the entrance watching children race their parents toward waiting cars with paintings held carefully against their chests. The city around us remained as busy as ever, but neither of us felt any need to hurry. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had walked away the first night?" Adrian asked softly. I smiled. "You mean after I locked the door?" He laughed, the sound lighter than it had ever been. "Yes." I looked back at the arts center glowing warmly behind us. "I think you still would have built an impressive life." He nodded slowly. "Perhaps. But I do not think it would have felt like home." He looked through the front window where Mason's two drawings now hung side by side on the classroom wall for every child to see. "Neither would I." As the evening breeze carried the laughter of children through the open doorway, I finally understood the lesson our story had been writing from the very beginning. Real power is never measured by how many people lower their heads when you enter a room. It is measured by how many people stand a little taller because you chose to walk into their lives with humility, kindness, and the courage to become better than you were yesterday.